Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this public event put on by SPERI, the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. My name's Tony Payne. I'm one of the directors of SPERI, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see so many people turn out on a midweek evening in February for a book launch. It gives you hope. As you know, if you're a follower of SPERI, we try to organise in the university a range of different types of events, and tonight, as I've said, is a book launch. To be precise, the launch in the north of England of the paperback edition of a novel first published in hardback last year. The novel is called Capital, and the author is John Lanchester. So what you might be thinking is SPERI doing launching a novel? Aren't we supposed to be focused on politics and economics? Well, in order to answer that question, I need to introduce to you John Lanchester, our main guest. John is a very unusual type of writer. He was recently described in The Observer, I think, as one of Britain's great literary polymaths, a master of fiction and memoir, essays and journalism. He actually published his first novel, called The Debt for Pleasure, in 1996. And he didn't have a bad start because he immediately won the Whitbread Book Award for first novels with it. Two other novels followed, and then a family memoir about his mother, a nun who walked out of her convent, changed her name, falsified her age, and concealed these facts from her husband and son until the end of her life. John began work on the novel that became Capital in 2006, but he didn't finish it until 2011. As I understand it, he became diverted along the way, as it were, by the need to properly understand the financial crisis which erupted in the Anglo-American world from 2007 onwards. And in early 2010, he published what I think is a remarkably incisive and pithy book about this crisis, engagingly called Whoops, Why Everyone Owes Everyone and No One Can Pay. As I said, in my view, it's a brilliant little book, and I certainly recommended it to everyone I knew. John then went back to Capital and finished and published that book in 2012. And in a very real sense, it is, I think, a novel of the crisis and flows out of Whoops. But amidst all this, John is additionally a busy, indeed prolific journalist, writing for a range of newspapers and magazines, but most notably perhaps for the London Review of Books, of which he's one of the contributing editors. And just last month, in fact, in the LRB, he brought out a withering critique of the current government's economic policy entitled simply and pointedly, Let's Call It Failure. Now, when John's in journalist mode, he writes extraordinarily sharply, in my view, leaving no prisoners at all when he decides to attack somebody or something. And in that essay in the London Review of Books, he used a phrase which I had never seen used before, which I thought at least was totally original in its usage, when he talked of how policy wonks love being proved Nate Silverishly right. Now, I accept that the phrase Nate Silverish isn't yet quite as widely used as Thatcherite or Kafkaesque or words like that, but I think it could catch on. And for anyone who hasn't got any idea of what I'm on about, I'll explain right at the end of the evening who Nate Silver is, and therefore what it is to do something in a Nate Silverish way. Final point of introduction about John. He's also been The Guardian's restaurant critic for the past couple of years, and rarely, it seems, finds anywhere entirely satisfactory to eat. Well, we're taking him to Loch Fyne after the event, which is probably very bad news for Loch Fyne and possibly also not very good news for John. But anyway, with me and John on stage are two other friends and colleagues. May I also introduce to you Professor Mick Moran from the University of Manchester and Professor Sue Weiss from our own School of English Language, Literature and Linguistics. Mick is a professor of politics who's written extensively over the years on many aspects of British politics, but notably on the subject of the City of London and its impact on the making of public policy in this country. Sue is a professor of literature who specialises in contemporary writing and whose most recent book was an examination of the work of the television playwright Jack Rosenthal. Mick and Sue are going to begin the evening by giving brief comments on capital from their differing disciplinary perspectives. John will then talk for a while about his book, considering, I think, or I hope, how and why he came to write it and perhaps what he feels about it now, picking up the links to Whoops. We will then open up to some questions from the audience, and then finally, after I've offered a short vote of thanks and hopefully remembered to tell you who Nate Silver is, there will be an opportunity if you want to buy copies of John's books and get him to sign a copy. And for that, I'm very grateful to colleagues from Blackwell's, our own university bookshop, for responding so willingly to SPERI's request to help with this event. So please welcome all of our speakers. Mick will speak first, then Sue, then John, and then we will open to the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for the invite. And I want to begin by saying something obvious, how much I enjoyed reading Capital. And that's not simple politeness. I suspect I'm the only person in this hall tonight, apart from John, who's read the book twice. When Tony asked me to come and do this session, I'd already read Capital. It was bought me by one of my kids as a birthday present on its publication. I had to obviously reread it for this evening's event, and I had to look out another copy because my son, having bought it for me, immediately borrowed it to read himself, and I have a strong suspicion that the only reason the bugger bought it for me was so that he could read it. But it is a wonderful read, and I also do want to say what a fabulous book. I'm not going to talk about it, obviously, what a fabulous book Whoops is. I mean, part of my day job is to try to explain in plain English what was going on in the financial crisis, and this book puts people like me to shame. It's indeed only this week I recommended it to my students at Manchester Business School, but before you crack open the champagne, John, they're students, they're business school students, and they're notoriously miserly. I don't think you'll see much of a spike in sales. But to Capital. Strange, isn't it, how much of London still lies south of the river? Not my words. They're the words of Norman Collins. And of course, most of the Capital is set south of the river. Norman Collins is the author of an earlier Condition of London book called, indeed, London Belongs to Me. And that remark, strange about how much of London still lies south of the river, reminds us precisely about how far Capital is indeed in the tradition of London novels. London novels usually tell us a lot about material living conditions. If we consider London Belongs to Me, it's set in Dulcimer Street. It can't be very far from the setting of Pepys Road, which is the key location for Capital. And one learns an awful lot about living conditions in boarding houses in the interwar years from London Belongs to Me. Coincidentally, alongside Capital, I've been working my way through Anthony Powell's Music of Time sequence, which also tells us a huge amount about material conditions in districts like Soho and Fitzrovia in the interwar years, in the war itself, and in the years immediately after the war. Well, there's one big difference between Capital and these earlier Condition of London novels. Those earlier novels never tell us what houses cost. In Capital, we know exactly what houses on Pepys Road fetch. Indeed, after reading it, I could almost set myself up as an estate agent for Pepys Road. The properties in Capital sometimes seem more alive than the people. This is a passage from very close to the conclusion of the book. It's when the banker who's come to grief has had to sell up and is moving out. The house was expecting the new people to move in. The house was waiting for the new thing, waiting to stage a new production. So this is a condition of London, a condition of England novel. And in Capital, the account of the condition of London is really incredibly dark and pessimistic. That's a contrast, for instance, with the final tone of a book like London Belongs to Me, which is uplifting right at the end. The account of London that you get from Capital is that this is a city at the end of its tether. And indeed, the novel fittingly ends with an invocation for change. Roger Yount, the banker whose life has come to grief, his last words end it. I promise I can change, change, change. Now, that need for change is only partly due to the financial crash, which forms part of the narrative line of the novel. Indeed, at the end, the city of London, it already seems to be recovering. Roger's house is bought by serious cash buyers who paid full price. I think we can be fairly sure that there were corporate lawyers or investment bankers. Capital portrays a society and a culture really at the end of its tether. Some of the examples of it. Almost every native English character in the novel is a schmuck. Rich, stupid, obsessed with money and possessions. Only the lower middle class Howes are the exception, and they've, of course, mostly migrated out to Essex. The native English workers in Capital are absolutely useless. The rich English, the appalling Arabella, Roger's wife, the rich English rely on Polish builders, Hungarian nannies for the appalling Arabella, even African footballers. And the glimpses of life that you get in London, life beyond Pepys Road, are really quite horrifying. It's a brutalized culture, alcohol-fueled, characterized very often by mass public drunkenness. And it's about that point that one starts to wonder about Capital as a really pessimistic condition of London novel. Now, a novel isn't a social report. It doesn't have to be, obviously, sociologically accurate. But if you read the novel, and I hope you will, because as I began by saying, it's a wonderful read, you'll certainly come away, I think, very depressed about the society it portrays. And after I finished it for the second time, I started to think, well, okay, it's not a sociological document, but actually, London isn't a city at the end of its tether. It's not had a bad 30 years. So here are some, if you like, sociological reasons to be cheerful about London after you've been depressed by the novel itself. First of all, London possesses an extraordinarily productive and successful economy. The standard measures of productivity that we use, commonest is gross value added per head. By those standard measures, London not only leads the UK, but is actually pulling away from the other regions. Now, one reason it's pulling away from the other regions is a second development of the last 30 years, one which is given short shrift in Capital and which is, I think it's fair to say, denounced in Whoops. And that's what's usually called the Big Bang, the much maligned Big Bang, the wholesale deregulation of financial markets in London that began in the 1980s, and the spurt of deregulation and innovation in a wider service economy, which the Big Bang prompted. Now, there's a lot wrong with the consequences of the Big Bang, and Whoops is very good on that. But it's important to say that in the City of London, there never was a pre-Big Bang golden age. There wasn't a past when people were honest, to be contrasted with a post-Big Bang world where people are ruthlessly dishonest. The City of London is basically the history of the City of London is basically a history of upper-class spivery in the old city. The history of the Lloyd's insurance market is a history of crookedness in the 70s and 80s. And when I first went round the city interviewing people in the late 70s and early 80s, it was made very plain to me that insider trading in the city was absolutely the norm. Insider trading only began to be, first of all, condemned and then criminalized with the arrival of these hyper-competitive foreigners like Americans who didn't like those kinds of practices. So that's a second reason to be cheerful. There's something to be said for the Big Bang and all that went with it. Here's a third reason. One source of the greater success of the London economy in the last 15 or 20 years is undoubtedly the successful reconstruction of London government from 1997. That's to say, the creation of the elected mayor and of the Greater London Assembly. London not only has the most successful economy in Britain, it also has the only working example of successful regional government in England. Indeed, the innovations of 1997-8 are the most successful institutional innovation in English government since the extension of franchise to women, in English government, since the extension of franchise to women. Here's another reason to be cheerful. London, more than any other city in Britain, has embraced multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity. That's what the results of the extraordinary results of the 2011 census that were released a few weeks ago tell us. It's transformed itself into a highly successful world city, perhaps the most successful of all world cities. It's also, more than any other city in Britain, confronted its legacies of racism, for instance, the Macpherson report on policing, and homophobia. And finally, it's seen huge social advances in the last 15 or 20 years. Seen, for instance, the transformation of performance in the school system in the last 15 years. I don't know, John, if you'll come across the Younts in future, maybe when you're writing a sequel, but the Younts are obsessed with the idea that their children must go to expensive private schools. You might tell them the good news that state schools in London are an extraordinary success story. And although we can argue about other indicators of social malaise, we can argue about how to measure crime, and we can argue about how to measure drunkenness, there's growing evidence that levels of crime are falling in London, and even levels of binge drinking are falling in London. Of course, that's not much good for a condition of London novel. One isn't going to get very far with a story that's built on a theme that says the condition of London is actually quite good and is probably improving. Capital remains a wonderful novel, but as I say, after you've read it, you might like to think on some of the reasons to be cheerful that I've summarized. Thanks very much.
I'm also really pleased to be here, and I'm going to start out agreeing or pretending to agree with what Mick Moran says, and then disagreeing with his estimate of capital as pessimistic. I agree that it is in some ways a dystopian novel, as Mick has mentioned, and the title alone obviously suggests that the capital, our capital city, is synonymous with capitalism, and as we now know, that's a bad thing. In fact, if we were to add a German definite article, the novel would have the same name as Marx's treatise, Das Kapital, and both texts are exposés of class-based injustice and monetary inequality. Capital, like Das Kapital itself, reveals the fact that people are now the prey of objects and not the other way round. The African footballer Freddie, who Mick has mentioned, a character in the novel, thinks about London. It's as if the whole city is for sale, and it seemed too as if many of the people were on display, as if they too are to be sold. But since Freddie is young and about to be rich, he says he finds this delightful, every bit of it. But his father Patrick is not so sure, as someone a bit older, and he finds that the display of designer objects in the King's Road is somewhat off-putting and baffling. He says he sees for sale shoes you can't walk in, chairs you can hardly sit on, and he was so far from wanting any of them for himself that it wasn't the things for sale that were useless, but he himself. This is a kind of commodity fetishism, as analysed by Marx, that has become internalized. Literary dystopias, like London novels, as we've heard from Mick, have a long history. In Capital, the fact that the street where all the characters live or work is called Pepys Road, and if you look these up, as I have, they're all south of the river for some reason, also reveals the novel's own awareness of its literary heritage, and perhaps Samuel Pepys' description of the plague and the Great Fire of London are earlier precursors of the credit crunch which we have more recently experienced. But it is specifically as a literary text that I would say Capital is most clearly not dystopian, but actually a utopian and even upbeat novel. One of its closest literary forebears is Charles Dickens and his London novels, and Capital shares a great vitality, inventiveness and energy with Dickens' writing, and their concerns with injustice and financial misdemeanour. In Capital, as we've heard, we read about Roger, the banker's deputy Mark, who commits fraud in order to show that he ought to be the boss. Think about that strange logic. In Dickens' Little Dorrit, we read about Mr. Merdle, who is so enmeshed in toxic debts and fraud that his bank goes bust and he himself commits suicide. The energy of Capital lies in several of its literary features, and I'm going to mention a few of these. First, its plot is both gripping and filmic, with a mystery thrown in. It's set up as a montage in which different stories are interleaved with each other so that we move between Polish builder, a Zimbabwean asylum seeker, a banker, and a corner shop owner. As Dickens showed in another of his great London novels, Bleak House, through the figure of Joe the crossing sweeper, everyone is connected and crosses by each other eventually. In Capital, I saw the equivalent of Joe is a traffic warden, Quentina. Like Joe, Quentina keeps the road clear, allegedly, and everyone in the novel interacts with her and through her. Also like Joe, she's at the bottom of society as a stateless person, an asylum seeker who is eventually arrested for working illegally. So these are the people today who are at the bottom of our social structure. Secondly, Capital's positive energy arises from its use of telling small literary detail, something which is particularly important in a long novel where you want something small to grasp hold of. For instance, Roger, the banker, doesn't know how to make hot chocolate for his children. He's so used to relying on the nanny. For the old-style policeman with a rough London accent, even stating his own name came across faintly but perceptibly as a threat. Quentina, the traffic warden, who works illegally, wears an elaborate pale green uniform. I'm sure this will strike a chord with any reader of the text, of which the narrator says she looked like the Marx Brothers' idea of a colonel in the Ruritanian Customs Service from 1905. At the other end of the social spectrum, when Roger is sacked from his job and marched across the office by a security guard, we're told, as all his colleagues watch him go, that never had so many screens of data been ignored by so many traders for so long. These details are not just unmotivated flourishes. Quentina's grand uniform contrasts ironically with her lowly status, and there is a meaningful bathos in the echo of Churchill's tribute to the Battle of Britain pilots in describing investment traders, of all people. In fact, Capital is a time capsule. Mick explained that John Lanchester began work on it in 2006, and this novel is very closely centred on just 11 months, starting in November 2007, as an anatomy of how we came to be in our present state. The novel manages an accurate glance backwards in time in a slightly disconcerting way, so that characters are still using MySpace, if you can remember that, and the Occupy movement is undreamt of, although one of the characters does presciently or ominously use the phrase, "we're all in this together." Third, the characters themselves also have a great energy. I really like the portrayal of the investment banker Roger Yount, who is out of place in the new financial world because he is too lazy to be nasty and scheming. And touchingly, he's also too lazy and too vain, even to consider having an affair with the nanny. So is morality born. I also liked his wife, Arabella. Mick and I will agree to differ about that, I think, who says that she and her husband are not really rich, but just your typical struggling London well-off. She also declares the fact that she and the nanny can fit into each other's clothes is proof that there is a God. Fourth, another example of the novel's great liveliness and energy is the creation of unexpected emotional engagement. At the novel's opening, Roger works out that if he doesn't get £1 million bonus, he will go broke. In a scene that unfolds so gradually that while he opens his bonus envelope to find out that he's only been given the amount of a normal salary, we feel his pain. We might also unexpectedly feel sympathy for Mark, the fraudster, when he's almost caught in the act when he's secretly looking at a colleague's computer monitor. How many of us would wriggle out of that one, and he does so ingeniously, and I believe that as readers we are relieved when he does so. So to return to the question of whether London is shown in a negative or positive light in the novel, in terms of the plot it's quite a mixed picture. We often see a mixture of acclimatising, literally, because of the emphasis that's placed on the grim weather, and of settling in. The Polish builder decides that after all he does quite like baked beans as a British national dish, and he will settle in London. Two British Muslim brothers become de-radicalised, though I wondered if that was rather a neat resolution. The African footballer's father is pleased to be able to return to Senegal and to food that tastes of something, as he puts it rather touchingly, although the story of Quentina, the asylum seeker, is, most distressingly of all, not resolved. I read Roger Yount's call for change at the end of the novel as a positive statement of determination and intent rather than one of desperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Mick. Thank you, Sue. To anyone who's wondering what it's like sitting there and being described in the third person for 30 minutes, it's a funny mixture of it's very flattering, but it's also a bit like being the subject of that Radio 4 special needs program, Does He Take Sugar? Yeah, so both at the same time. This book I wrote in a different way. The conception was different from the normal way I start a novel. My normal method is like something described by Geoffrey Bernard, who's a wonderful old drunk who used to write a column in The Spectator about being a wonderful old drunk. And it mainly consisted of things he'd seen in his local pub, the Coach and Horses, and he once claimed to have overheard at the bar the following conversation. First man, I'm writing a novel. Second man, neither am I. And that's usually what it's like for me. But this instance was slightly different. The prompt for the book was a sort of chance remark made by my wife. She said something along the lines of, there's something that would have interested Dickens about the state of London today. And the funny thing about that, as an observation, that it was easier to understand at the time than it is to explain now. It was something to do with the condition of London being like a mid-19th century condition. And inequality was a big part of that. Levels of inequality in measurable ways are returning to 19th century levels. And you can see them in London simply by looking out the window, just as Dickens could. And there are also just extremes of good and bad fortune visible by looking out the window too. And as in Victorian London, it's a place where people go to make their fortunes. Except instead of Dick Whittington, it's Polish builders and plumbers and cleaners and Czech nannies and French bond dealers and Russian dentists and Australian art dealers. And that's just to name people that I actually know in person. You have every possible combination of person and origin and profession and ambition. And what this all added up to for me was that Britain in general seemed to me a place that's undergone convulsive change, the kind of change that's all the more marked because it's kept happening slowly and steadily. I grew up abroad, mainly in Hong Kong, and when I first passed through London in the 70s, it seemed a drab and in many respects a very provincial place. And the other big thing about it was that everything was grey. The weather was grey, the buildings were grey, the The people were grey, and the food was grey. In fact, the entirely new kinds of greyness seem to have been invented specially for the food. And nobody could now think that about the city. It's a place of immense and sometimes overwhelming variety and colour and energy, and with an edge of, often I think, with an edge of anger. I notice it when I go away and come back. It reminded me of when I first travelled to New York when I was a student in 1982. And I remember thinking how exciting it was and energising, and as if the air was slightly caffeinated. But it also felt like a dangerous place, a place where you could suddenly make a wrong turn, either geographically or in a human interaction, and find yourself in trouble. And when I go back to London after I've been away, I have that same feeling. It feels like an exciting place, but not necessarily a particularly safe one. And I think, that kind of scale, I think London's a proxy for the UK, I think they're that different, is the kind of thing that you normally get in societies only after wars and revolutions. But I think because it's happened year by year by year, we haven't really noticed the extent to which Britain has fundamentally changed. A crucial part of that is the way London's become a world city. Even more than when it was the capital of a global empire, it's a world city. And the world presses on London and is present in it. I remember one afternoon I locked myself out of the house by leaving the keys inside. And so I ended up spending the whole day in the pub, which I don't often do these days. And I got talking to a Polish woman who was showing her mother around London. She was working as a nanny, despite having a PhD in child psychology, but she'd come to London because the opportunities were greater. Slightly wondering what she was doing in the pub, to be honest, because if you think you had drunk people back in Warsaw, but anyway. And she was talking about being in London and giving various sort of sensible, practical reasons for being there. And then her face sort of changed, and she said, and of course, there's also something like you could call the London dream. And I never had this very vivid sense in her expression and her voice of wistfulness and longing, and the sense that London's now a place where people come from all over the world with this idea of making it. If you make it there, you can make it anywhere. And that really stayed with me when I was thinking about the book. And of course, it's an upside of immigration, an upside that I think often isn't spelt out as strongly as it should be, that we live in a place where people are desperate to come. I think I feel that particularly strongly because, as I say, I grew up in Hong Kong. And the thing about Hong Kong is it's a culture created by refugees. Almost nobody, going back 2 generations, is actually from Hong Kong. It's all refugees from communist China. And all through my childhood, not quite on a daily basis, but certainly on a weekly basis, people, unfortunate trying to flee to Hong Kong would drown swimming across the South China Sea and be washed up on beaches. And other people risked their lives crossing the border that was guarded by the People's Liberation Army on one side and the British Army on the other. And they were only safe from being repatriated and ending up in prison if they got to a place in Kowloon with the appropriate name of Boundary Street. If you made it to Boundary Street, you could stay and you'd have residence. And in ways that I don't think I realised at the time, that had a big impact on me. The fact that we lived in a place where people risked their lives to get to every single day. And it drove home a lesson about the most fundamental and basic distinction of all between societies, ones that people are desperate to get to, and ones that people are desperate to escape from. I don't think this comes up enough when we're talking about immigration. We have high levels of immigration because people are desperate to live here. And it's a potent thing to be that kind of place, a place people are desperate to be. And I have to say that I know that people process their experience of emigration in their own communities very differently. And I also know that my experiences are unusual and privileged in that I'm not worried about losing my job to an immigrant, because in a sense I don't actually have a job to start with. And I'm also biased because I'm a kind of immigrant myself. My mother was Irish, born in Ireland. My father was born in Africa, grew up mainly in Australia and Hong Kong. I was born in Germany. But my feeling about immigration, about living in a place where people want to come, is that it makes me personally feel safe. We live in a place where a lot of people would want to if they had the choice. And that's a good thing. And if you don't think it's a good thing, all you have to do is ask people who live in that other kind of place whether they would rather be in the lifeboat or in the water. And it's the upshot of that process that Mick was talking about. You know, you see in the 2011 census, came out about a month ago, it's a really striking figure. London is now 45% white British, so it's majority not white British. That's an unusual thing for a British city anyway, but it's particularly remarkable for a capital city to have a minority of its own ethnicity and history of citizens. I think it's the only capital in the world of which you can say that. But having said which, even those who are optimistic about the impact of these things, you can't be Pollyanna-ish. And you know, some of the dreams that bring people here are dark. The example that really stays in my mind about that was something the novelist Giles Foden told me, that the facts that claimed responsibility for the Al-Qaeda bombing of the US Embassy in Nairobi in 1993, the facts that claimed that was sent anonymously from a newsagent in Willesden. That's like something out of Joseph Conrad, the mixture of the suburban and the kind of semi-comic and the horror. And I was very interested by that side of London, the dark dreams that some people have that bring them there. And another thing that you see in the city is the press of modernity, the press of change. And the thing that interested me about that is that that's now a thing that comes to everyone, everywhere. If you never go anywhere, never do anything, spend your whole life in the same village and have an entirely stable private living, one day you'll wake up in the morning and look out the window and not recognize the world around you. It's just a condition of modernity. Change comes to everyone, and you will be dislocated by it. And I'm interested in the city, the urban experience is just as a kind of head start version of that. So I was starting to think about what I would call my big fat London novel, and weaving those themes into it. And that was, and wandering around aimlessly in the Geoffrey Bernard, I'm writing a novel, neither am I type way. And that was how the book started to take shape, through that wandering around, because as I wandered around the part of town where we live, I began to notice how much it had changed, partly with the impact of financial services, which, as Mick was saying, have really fundamentally altered the character of London. And I've started to register for the first time the kind of texture of that. And one of the simple things about it is that you don't see men of a certain class and demographic in the day at all. It's like a work of feminist science fiction, really. All the men have been, because they've gone by dawn and they're back after dark. But it's like a work of feminist science fiction because they've been zapped by an alien death ray, but they're continuing to reproduce because they're still having children who are being loaded into SUVs and driven off to things. And the other thing that comes with that, with the bonuses pouring into the London housing stock, is that it's as if the houses have become people in their own right. They're so expensive that it's as if the houses are now these kind of demanding, imperious beings. And so I'd like to read a short passage from the beginning of the book that is actually the point at which the book started to take shape in my head. It was with this thing of just looking at the street. For most of its history, the street was lived in by more or less the kind of people it was built for, the aspiring, not too well off. They were happy to live there, and living there was part of a busy and determined attempt to do better, to make a good life for themselves and their families. But the houses were the backdrops to their lives. They were an important part of life, but they were a set where events took place rather than principal characters. Now, however, the houses had become so valuable to people who already lived in them, and so expensive for people who recently moved into them, that they had become central actors in their own right. This happened at first slowly, gradually, as average prices crept up through the lower 100,000s, and then as people from financial services discovered the area and house prices in general began to rise sharply, and people began to be paid huge bonuses that were 3 or 4 times their notional pay, bonuses that were huge multiples of the national average salary, and a general climate of hysteria began to affect everything to do with house prices. Then, suddenly, prices began to go up so quickly it was as if they had a will of their own. There was a sentence which rang down the decades, a very English sentence. "Did you hear what they got for that place down the road?" Once, the amazingly big figure under discussion involved sums which just crept into 10,000s. Then they were in the multiples of 10,000. Then they were in the low 100,000s, then in the high 100,000s, and now they were in 7 figures. It began to be all right for people to talk about house prices all the time. The topic came up in conversation within the first seconds of people speaking to each other. When people met, they held off the subject of house prices with a conscious sense of restraint and gave in to the desire to talk about them with relief and straight away. It was like Texas during the oil rush, except instead of sticking a hole in the ground to make fossil fuel shoot up from it, all people had to do was sit there and imagine the cash values of their homes rattling upwards so fast they couldn't see the figures go round. Once parents had gone off to work and children off to school, you saw fewer people in the street in the day except builders. But the houses had things brought to them all day. As the houses got more expensive, it was as if they came alive and had wishes and needs of their own. Vans brought wine. There were 2 or 3 different vans of competing dog walkers. There were florists, Amazon parcels, personal trainers, cleaners, plumbers, yoga teachers, all day long, all of them going up to the houses like supplicants and then being swallowed up by them. There was laundry, there was dry cleaning, there were FedEx and UPS deliveries, there were dog beds, printer ribbons, garden chairs, vintage film posters, same-day DVD purchases, eBay coups. People came to the houses to beg and to sell things, towels for the homeless, utility company salesmen. The tradesmen and trainers and craftsmen disappeared into the buildings and came out when the buildings were finished with them. The houses were now like people, and rich people at that, imperious, with needs of their own that they were not shy about having serviced. There were builders in the street all the time, doing up lofts and kitchens and knocking through and adding on, and there was always at least one skip parked in the street and at least one set of scaffolding. The new craze was for doing up basements and turning them into kitchens, playrooms, or utility rooms, and the houses going in for this craze had conveyors of dirt flowing into skips outside. But because the earth was compressed by the weight of the buildings above them, as it was dug up, it expanded to 5 or 6 times its original size. So there was something bizarre, even sinister about the digging, as if the earth was spreading, vomiting, rejecting its own excavation. And far, far too much of it seemed to come out of the ground, as if it were fundamentally unnatural to reach down into the earth to take up more space, and the digging could go on forever. Having a house in Pepys Road was like being in a casino in which you were guaranteed to be a winner. If you already lived there, you were rich. If you wanted to move there, you had to become rich. It was the first time in history this had ever been true. Britain had become a country of winners and losers, and all the people in the street, just by living there, had won. Now, having had the notion that started at that point of writing this, as it were, 19th century novel about a 19th century city, I very consciously wanted to have someone the other day called it a neo-Victorian toolkit, which I didn't at all mind as a description, because I think there are 2 ways of writing about change from the technical point of view, and it's easier to explain using a film metaphor. You can have techniques that chop and change and are rapid and give a sense of speed and pace, and the different characters have different visual languages, and there's a sense of fragmentation and speed and intercutting and elusiveness and kind of different visual vocabularies for everyone. Or you can use a fixed lens, a lens that doesn't change, that makes that has the same sort of perspective on everything, and that in some ways you see the changes and the speed and the fragmentation more vividly for the fact that the technique is stable. So you have a technique that reflects lots of change, or you have a steady one that makes the change seem external. And it was the second kind of technique that interested me, and I did consciously borrow a kind of Victorian set of things about objectivity and giving myself permission to know as much or as little as I wanted about the characters. And the other thing is that I was thinking at the start, the book would take me about 4 or 5 years to write. Now, I wish novels didn't take that long, and I don't know why they do, but but they do, and I've sort of gradually got used to it. And that image where the book started, these houses being served as if they were rich people, seemed very obviously to be the symptom of a boom which was certain to be followed by a bust. It was obviously out of hand. I mean, since I've got interested in this stuff, I've seen examples of things that were more out of hand. I was in Iceland in 2009, and after their very spectacular implosion, and was talking to a waitress in a cafe. And I was asking her about how things had changed since the economic crash. And she said, well, you know, for instance, if I wanted to see my friends for the weekend, we go camping. I went, oh, what did you used to do? She said, oh, we used to take a plane to Milan and go shopping in the Via Linate. Now, we didn't go quite as collectively nuts as that, but we did go a little bit nuts. And it seemed to me that, you know, that there was going to be some sort of downturn on the other side, that this was a bubble. I didn't know what the bubble was going to be, but I felt there was one. And so I started the book assuming that there would be this kind of downturn later on, and it would give the story of a up and down momentum, a kind of arc. It follows that for the arc to work, there would have to be some sort of economic collapse. So it's implicit in the trajectory. No bust, no book. And that it would begin at that bubble moment that I've just read out. The reader would know that there was going to be a downturn. So it's what they call a dramatic irony, in the classic sense of dramatic irony, which is that you, the audience, know something that we, the actors, don't. If there were no lectern and my flies were undone, that would be a very cheap and cheerful sort of Channel 5 version of dramatic irony. But that's the classic definition of it. You know something we don't. So the reader would know something that the characters didn't know, that this crash was about to come. You know, it might seem reckless to bet years of work on the crash, but in fact it seemed obvious to me that there was going to be one, partly because I'd already lived through a crash. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and philosopher, he once said that an intelligent person of 40 has seen everything that can possibly happen in the world. And before the credit crunch, I used to think that was true. And certainly in my case, I'd lived through a boom and bust cycle before, which house prices went down by about 35% in the late 80s, though it was hidden by inflation. People didn't realize quite how much money they were losing. And I had a ringside seat of that, or not even a ringside seat, I had a seat on the cockpit of the plane, because I bought my first flat in 1987, which is the very peak of the boom. So I was, you know, well aware of the fact that busts tend to follow booms, and was very interested by the fact that 1987 crash, people behaved as if it was 1787. There was this complete amnesia and obliviousness about the fact that the simplest law of economics is that, you know, what goes up must come down. What this meant that in parallel with writing my novel, I was observing the movements of the economy, first on the upward bit of the roller coaster and then sharply down the other side. And that's not the subject of Capital, it's the background to it. But it left me fascinated by the story of what actually happened in the real world. And it seemed very interesting that there was this blindingly obvious disaster about to happen, which, apart from a few hacks and commentators, in general, people seemed oblivious to. And that obliviousness I still find obliviousness very interesting. I think it's, as a species, we have a profound talent for being oblivious and a real appetite for it. And it's a big theme in the book. So what happened in autumn 2009, early 2010, I finished a draft of Capital, and I did what I always do. When I finish the first draft of a book, when I'm writing a novel, I do a bit every day, and I only have forward momentum. I don't reread, I don't revise, I just go forward, 500 words a day, until I get to the end of a draft, and then I have to have a break before I go back and sort of change personas in order to see it clearly and finish it off. You need a sort of editorial mindset which is colder and clearer, and it takes time to sort of switch. And so I have a few months off, and I'm always making ambitious plans to do something with those few months, which I never do. I'm always planning to learn German, take up Pilates, find out what that weird smell in the cupboard is that's been bothering me for a while. Write a screenplay, that's another popular one that I've never done. But this time I said, no, actually, the hell with it. because I've been following the economic stuff, I am going to use that and write, in fairly short order, write a book about what actually happened in the real world. And because by that point, the crash had turned into this completely other thing. I was assumed it was a bog-standard property crash of the sort I knew, but it was this thing that was much more systemic, much bigger, much more global, and frankly, a lot more frightening. And it was a chance to use a lot of research that couldn't really fit in the book. I'd got very interested in the City of London. You have to be interested in the City of London if you're writing about London today, in the world of finance. But it was very difficult to incorporate that in the novel, because the real story of the crash was full of complex explanations of a sort that are essential for that to give an account, and which don't work in fiction at all. There are also fundamental difficulties with using research in fiction. If you research a subject, you end up using it. And if you go to Mumbai or to Loughborough, your characters end up going to Mumbai or Loughborough, even if in fact they've got no business being there and they're better off staying at home. And so I wanted to be really careful with the things I knew about the financial stuff, and to avoid the trap of, in science fiction there's a device about explanation. It's called "Tell me, Professor," and it's where a character turns to the professor and says, "Tell me, Professor, why does the quantum flux hyperdrive not work when we're in mega space?" And the professor, "I'm glad you asked me that question," and explains why, and the reader falls asleep. And the kinds of explanation needed in the story of the credit crunch, I thought had the risk of knocking the reader out cold to be woken up by the milkman. As Nigel watched the lights glinting off the towers of Canary Wharf, he struggled to remember the definition of a collateralized debt obligation. I don't think so. And the other thing that you can't do in fiction, fiction has to feel true. You can do pretty much anything in it, but it has to feel real. I mean, obviously the kind of limit case of this, there's a John Updike novel called Brazil, where the characters change race and gender halfway through. And it works as a novel. It's completely plausible. That shows you can do anything. But you can't account for the fact that lots of things that actually happen don't feel true at all. Life is full of things that don't seem even slightly plausible, but they actually happened. Life is full of unlikeliness, and unlikeliness is very, very difficult to fit in fiction. But this story was full of unlikely things. I mean, one example, there are these people in banking called quants who make mathematical models of things. And the Black Monday crash in 1987, which was 20-odd%, came off the value of share prices in a day, was what's called a 19 sigma event. Sigma is the measure of deviation from the standard. It's the measure of unlikeliness. So if you translate 19 sigma into English, the words of a book someone wrote about it, economists later figured that on the basis of the market's historical volatility, had the market been open every day since the creation of the universe, the odds would still have been against its falling that much in a single day. In fact, had the life of the universe been repeated 1 billion times, such a crash would still have been theoretically unlikely. Now, the defiance of common sense there is really amazing. If your mathematical model tells you that something's impossible, which is what that number means, and then it happens, then you know with certainty that your mathematical model is wrong. It just doesn't make sufficient allowance for reality. In this case, the unacknowledged reality was to do with something called portfolio insurance, computer programs. But it doesn't actually matter what the unacknowledged thing wrong was. It just matters that it doesn't work. Because when unexpected things happen, and as every grown-up knows, unexpected things happen all the time, the maths just broke. The Russian bond default of 1998 was a 7 sigma event. That means it should statistically happen only once every 3 billion years. And it wasn't the only one. The last few years have seen numerous 5, 6, and 7 sigma events. They're supposed to happen one day every 13,392 years, that's 5 sigma, one day every 4,039,906 years, that's 5 sigma, 6 sigma, and one day every 3,105,395,365 years. And yet they kept happening, and no one concluded that the maths was broken. Now, you can't put that in a novel. It's too unlikely. But it did happen. And I got fascinated by this whole economic world, which is full of things of interest and drama that were completely unknown to the wider general public. Certainly I didn't know them at all myself. And there's always a lot in our culture about the two cultures of science and the arts, drawn from that C.P. Slow lecture in 1959, saying that, that there was too big a gap between the arts and science. But it seemed to me that the two cultures idea isn't really true about science and the arts anymore, that you can get a good general education in the basics of science. There's a lot of very good popular science explanations, but there was a huge gap between the world of economics and finance and the rest of us, and that the gap had been very problematic, become very problematic for society and for democracy. That you have lots of bright, literate, functioning adults. There's actually 4 different things: bright, literate, functioning adult, who have no idea about all sorts of basics of the type that financial insiders and people who speak money just take for granted. One example being interest rates. When the financially literate talk about interest rates, they bring to bear a whole set of linked ideas about inflation, unemployment, the cost of borrowing, the exchange rate, political impact of the cost of mortgages, conditions of trade for business, price of export, balance of trade, growth or contraction of the economy, all that packed into just 2 words: interest rates. They just flit past. And to people who don't, as it were, speak finance, the language can become impenetrable and the interlocking ideas too complex to grasp or unpack. And I thought then, and I still think, that it's a real issue for our democracy that we need to address, that, without a firmer grasp of these things, that our democracy, the texture of it is a bit thinner than it should be, because people are effectively making choices they don't really understand in the ballot box. And the other thing about it, of course, is that it's really interesting too, the economic stuff. As a writer, you get more and more interested. As a novelist, I think you get more, is what's the thing behind the thing? What's the story behind the obvious story? What's the thing that I don't immediately see? And obviously, in fiction, there's lots of psychological understanding of that that's very rewarding, to see the thing behind the veil. But the economic understanding of that is very important too, because the thing behind the thing is very often just to do with economic forces. The other thing I'd add is it's also often really interesting too, and you constantly see in the financial world things that just don't seem to cross over to the mainstream press. It was there were 2 things at the weekend, from the Financial Times this weekend, that were really striking, that the gap between London and the rest of the UK in terms of these property prices is now so stark that Wandsworth, which is a borough in southwest London, quite a lot of bankers live there. It's called Nappy Valley, because people go there when they have families. And Gordon Ramsay lives there, and also lots of people who aren't horrible live there too, I should say. But the housing stock in Wandsworth is now worth only slightly less than the whole housing stock in Northern Ireland. It's one not very big borough. A place called Edenbridge, which I'd never heard of, in Surrey, is popular with city workers, and apparently there's a Russian aspect to it too. Edenbridge is worth more than Glasgow. And that seemed to me an amazing thing about where we are today, and that, that should be front page news, and it should be in every paper instead of buried in the financial pages. The other thing that was really striking in FT at the weekend was that since 1980, the Indian government has twice been brought down because of crises in the price of onions. So I didn't know. Onion prices are very volatile, and they're very consequential in Indian politics. Anyway, so I went off and acquired this self-education in money and wrote the book. And when I got back to Capital, there's a thing Stephen King suggests for books, that write it first draft as fast as you can, and in the second draft, try and treat it as if it's someone else's book. Read it thinking about what its themes are. When you go back to finish it, address its themes as if they were someone else's. And it struck me when I came back to it that one of the big themes in the book was to do with community, which is a word I've always loathed because it's used so unthinkingly, and usually in areas where there isn't really any community at all. I think my experience of London life is that there's no community in the geographical sense, that people have family communities, work communities, they have communities of interests, they increasingly have communities that they found for themselves on the internet, but But that thing that you're in a community with the people who just happen to live in the next door houses, I've never seen that. And I'm interested whether that's a general thing, because I don't know whether that's really a thing about London or about big cities or about modernity in general, or whether it's just kind of very specific geographical thing. I get the impression, actually, talking to people in different places, that that's actually very different in very different locations, that's not a general truth. But it's certainly what I've seen in London. And it was one of the things I concentrated on in revising and finishing the book, that the fact that the people in the novel in Pepys Road, they're right on the edge of having nothing in common with each other at all. That they just barely brush against each other, and their lives barely intersect. And in the novel, the characters get caught up in the same story because they all get postcards to their door with this slogan written on them: "We want what you have." I mean, the cards and the mystery around them are the spine of the story, and they're what integrates the narrative around the characters and their own individual stories. But I wanted that integration to feel like something that we were lucky to observe, and for the way the characters float past each other's lives to feel fragile and tentative, because in my experience of city life, the way we float past each other does feel fragile and tentative. Politicians like to say, we've all heard, I think we're all slightly sick of hearing it, that we're all in this together. But I don't think they really believe that, for the good reason that it's not true. In many ways, our society is so compartmentalized and fragmented in it that being in this together is a complete and precise and encompassing description of what we are not. In Capital, I wanted to make the reader experience the feeling of these strands being gathered up, and also to make the reader feel aware on finishing that that's a precious and elusive sensation, and the fact that actually in real life, community is something you have to will into being. It starts as a work of the imagination and becomes a work of will. It's not unlike a novel. And the strange thing with this book that I never felt before when I finished it, wasn't at all expected, that at the end of this long solitary work of writing a novel, I took away a strong feeling of the number of similarities there were between that solitary work and the other bigger and more socially important forms of collective enterprise. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, John. As I said, there's some opportunity now for some questions and answers, and we've got a rolling mic, so who would like to begin? Someone up the front here, if you could just... Microphone person, thank you. Do you want to stick with this?
My name's Nick Howard, and I used to teach in the adult education division in this university. I was a student at the LSE, and we did economics and politics and philosophy and psychology all lumped together into one degree. But we used to talk about earnings like rents, dividends and interest as invisibles. They went into the national accounts as invisibles. I'm just wondering whether the culture of the economy that we live in today is so full of invisibles that people can't recognize what's happening because they can't see them, they're invisible. I was listening this morning to a program on the crisis in the NHS, and we had two academics. One was Professor of Business Administration at Cranfield, and they were talking about the crisis as though it's a crisis of the culture of the NHS. The very last 30 seconds, I don't know if people listen to the Today programme, in the last 30 seconds you're given a chance to sum everything up. The Professor of Business Administration subbed it up by saying it's cuts, cuts, cuts. Now I wonder whether the description of capitalism that you've put into your novel, I haven't read it yet and I look forward to reading it, is very similar. You're just tackling the culture, not the economic reality that people live under. I have 3 children living in London, and they have tremendous problems daily in balancing their budgets, even though they're all fully employed.
I think, I mean, that hospital stuff really struck a chord with me because I've had several family members. Is it just cut out? Oh, sorry. Oh, it's fading in and out. Is it? Okay. So there is something horribly vivid that I think a lot of people will directly recognise that account of what's happened. I think one of the things I notice about my book is not the main point, by the way, of the whole story of what's happened, but just because I've been thinking about it. In a weird way, it's become a historical novel because it's set in 2007, 2008, and things look the same, and people look the same, and the places look the same, but everything has actually changed, and the main change is inside people's heads. There's been a really fundamental shift in attitudes and assumptions, and I think I particularly notice it among the young, that a kind of assumption of a gently rising parabola of shared prosperity has simply been broken. You know, people just don't feel that way about the next few years, the next decades. I mean, maybe more open-endedly than that. There's been a really profound shift, and I think it's both cultural and economic. You know, I think they're actually very hard to unpick because the kind of contract, I think the idea of gradually rising prosperity was a very important part of the British social contract. And, you know, the recent events have really, really tested that. And I think that's, the consequences haven't really been played through in terms of our sense of who we want to be. I know it's a wishy-washy and, given where we are, maybe inappropriately Cleggian thing to say it's sort of both. But I do think it's both. I don't think you can separate the cultural and the economic in terms of both the causal mechanisms and the impact on people's lives.
Often attributed to Keynes that he said, the market can remain irrational for longer than you can remain solvent. I just wonder, what would have happened to your novel if the crash had been delayed by another 5 or 10 years?
I'd have been royally screwed. That's funny, I've never actually thought about that. And let the record show, I mean, it was completely wrong too, you know. I mean, I was right in the sense that there was a crash, but if I'd been a city boy rushing around making huge bets, I would have lost everything, because I thought that the bubble would pop where the previous one popped in London property. I thought that would be the first thing to go, and then there would be this kind of cascade effect. And in fact, you know, pretty much the only asset category in the world that hasn't popped is London property. Which is actually a whole other subject in itself. It's really bizarre and disturbing, the thing that's the kind of insulation effect, and this thing of Britain gradually doing the splits, you know, in two rapidly diverging countries and economies. But yeah, no, I haven't thought about that. That would have been a real bummer. But I think actually probably, though, having said that, I could have just stuck it in a drawer and left it there, and then just change the dates. And the great thing with word processors, you could do that in one go, you know. Make it November 2013 and then whack it in. And wow, that was prescient. He wrote that quickly.
Hello, thanks for the introduction of the London. And I'm from journalism department. My name is Jiaxi Mai. And as a British journalist and writer, how would you compare the conditions in London and Hong Kong? Thank you very much.
Well, it's interesting that, I mean, I think it's easier being a writer in Britain, that's for sure, and it's easier being a writer and a journalist because it's unfettered to the point of danger, our press here. I think, you know, the Hong Kong I grew up in has gone. So I find it very difficult to talk about the place today. I actually find it quite difficult going back because this, straight as you know very well, you know, the whole, the physical environment has changed very dramatically, and you can stand in a place you know very well from 20 years ago, and there's not a single building that you recognise. But it smells the same because the harbour still has the same smell. So I find I get an almost form of psychic vertigo that half of my head is telling me, don't know where I am, and the other half is saying, no, this is completely familiar, and you're 8 years old again, you know where you are. So I actually find it troubling going back to Hong Kong, and I'm not up to speed on it. And I also, by the way, think that the kind of that it's a good thing that it's shed the kind of colonial past. That, you know, it was time for Hong Kong to become a Chinese city, which it now has. You know, I have no nostalgia for the place it was. The funny thing about journalism in Britain is that, as far as I can tell, it's about to go away as a profession. I've got a friend who, her daughter's just doing her A-levels, and they were having the "what do you want to do" conversation for the first time. And her daughter said, I think what I'd really like to do is become a journalist. To which her mum said, but darling, that's like saying you want to become a weaver. And I don't know what the state of the profession is like in Hong Kong, but certainly here, it's in an absolutely critical condition of imminent economic collapse, and it's certainly not going to exist in its present form by the end of this decade, and I'd say next 5 years.
I'm not going to call the head of the Department of Journalism to answer that. Someone at the front here, in fact, Sue herself, I think, would like to ask a question.
I wondered who was your favourite.
Oh, I don't really, I couldn't let myself have a favourite character, partly because it makes it harder to write. I mean, I had an image in my mind while I was writing it of the characters being like billiard balls or snooker balls, in that they all have the same mass. So you're not using all of them all the time, but when you interact with them, they sort of have the same specific gravity. And that's an unusual structure for a novel, because novels usually signal who the favourites are. And the English novel in particular is a kind of moral scorecard. I think that's one of the things that's limiting in a way about the English tradition, is that you know exactly what you're supposed to think about everyone morally, you know, marked out of 10. And I tried to have a structure that had, that, you know, everybody had an equal degree of feeling from me and an equal kind of mass. I don't know if I achieved that, but as I said, that was very much in my mind, an image of snooker balls, pool balls, this thing about the mass.
Hi, I've read Capital already, and I loved it, and I loved the talk. I'm Margie. I've got a lot of friends and family in London and have lived there myself a lot. I think I just want to sort of comment about this idea of the recovery and the fact that London's doing well and going to be okay. I mean, I think that depends where you're sitting, kind of economically, socially, and so on. I've got friends who work in social services for various London boroughs, and after the benefit cuts kick in April, they're expecting an apocalypse. I just wonder what your feelings are. Maybe the next real dystopian novel of London is going to be what happens after that.
I think, you know, the thing about us all not being in it together is going to be increasingly apparent. I mean, you know, the division between winners and losers all over Britain is brutal, and I do think there's there's a risk of London kind of bifurcating away from the rest of the UK. I sometimes get the feeling that it's almost detaching and floating off into the North Sea as a separate state, not just from Britain but from the rest of Europe, and being a bit like, in the way that Manhattan is very different from the rest of the United States. It has, you know, all the rich people, it's the centre of finance, it's the most ethnically diverse place, and it's also regarded by the citizens of the rest of the country as being kind of special case. I think that would be very unfortunate if it happened to London. I think there's some of the signs that it could happen. And as you're saying, at the same time, these astonishingly sharp and sharpening divisions. Because the big thing about the cuts, it's not in the political rhetoric, but it's in the numbers, very, very starkly in the numbers, is that we've barely started. You know, that something like 80% of the projected cuts just in this Parliament have yet to come. And I've never heard of anyone who works in that world who doesn't think it's going to be cataclysmic. I mean, there's a kind of funny bit like the distinction between Mick and Sue, optimistic, pessimistic. In a weird way, there's a kind of glimmer of hope there, because it's still unclear whether it can be done, the scale of the cuts that are projected. It's really unclear whether just the society will wear it. And I think, you know, and certainly when you make the point that it's barely begun, a chill does tend to settle on people. But yeah, on the projected things, the kind of figures, you know, something like 18% departmental cuts across everything except the protected bits. That's a really fundamentally altered landscape. One I don't remember anybody voting for.
I've also read Capital and a couple of the other books as well, but I'm a bigger fan of your non-fiction. So how do you approach them very differently, or do you approach them with different motivation? And you write the non-fiction stuff in the LRB in the book about the crash with such passion and a sort of critical sense of society gone wrong. It's, the fiction almost takes you away from that message, that kind of educational program that you're telling people, look, this is what a credit default swap is, and this is why you should know about them. But you can't do that in a novel. Do you feel divided between a kind of political, educative role and a kind of entertaining, fictional, you know, author role?
No, I like being able to do both. I mean, the thing I like most, just subjectively about journalism and non-fiction, is it reminds you you're not dead when you're writing it, because you do actually finish it. You know, novels take years, and you can have a strange feeling of being a kind of figment of your own imagination. You know, if it's years between a book. This is my first novel in 10 years. And you know, most of that time I was actually working on it, but that's completely invisible and internal. I think everybody, you know, even friends and family, secretly think you've gone mad, and you're like a sort of mild-mannered version of Jack Nicholson in the Overlook Hotel, typing out the same sentence over and over and over again. So I like the feeling of interacting with the culture through writing non-fiction and having one say. And I've also become increasingly engaged. You know, I've come to, you know, I used to write football match reports and things like that, things that I was very interested by, but you know, you struggle to find a larger justification for it. And I've come to believe that there really is a gap in this culture. This stuff really does matter. And to feel sort of I don't mean to sound pompous, but in a sort of citizenly way, you know, that it's good to speak up about the things when I do know about them, and the infrequent occasions when I do actually know something about the topic under discussion. I find it helpful though, because it gives more space for the novels to do the sort of different thing that they do. They're large, you know, they're structures that are supposed to be in a way freestanding, and you can directly address an audience in non-fiction in a way that I would find difficult to do in a novel without it being really crap, I think. You know, that there's that kind of to the point, to the audience, and to the subject this week. In a novel, those are all flaws, because by the time it's read, it's no longer this week. That's not the audience. You've changed your mind anyway, you know, and you might have been wrong to start with. So I don't have a reader in mind for the novel. The reader, I think of it as I'm trying to make a thing, but all the non-fiction I write, I do have a reader in mind to whom I'm trying to speak.
I think I'm going to begin to wrap up there, because we want to try and organise a bit of book buying and book signing for anyone who wants to do that. Just 2 or 3 things to say by way of conclusion. Firstly, to thank John and Mick and Sue for very interesting sets of remarks. Fascinating to me to hear an author describe the way in which he wrote 2 very, very different books and how those 2 books interacted over time and in his head. And so in that sense, I'm very encouraged by our first foray into the study of literature as part of political economy. I'm also very pleased to be able to tell you that John's most recent publication, which was written this morning before leaving for Sheffield, is today's post on SPERI's blog, which we call SPERI Comment. We're now posting 2 or 3 posts a week of what we hope is good commentary on topics of political economy interest, and I do encourage those of you who haven't yet found the blog to have a look at it and perhaps even make it a part of your regular reading. And then finally, I did say I would just say something about Nate Silver at the end. You've probably forgotten about that, but you ought to know who Nate Silver is if you don't, and you ought to declare to people that you're going to be Nate Silverishly right about things. Nate Silver is a very young American statistician. He's only in his mid-30s. He runs a cult website called 538.com. I'm not going to start asking those of you what the significance of 538 is. It will become apparent. He started out forecasting the performances and career developments of Major League Baseball players in the United States, but he then turned to electoral predictions. And in the 2008 US presidential election, he correctly predicted the winner of 49 of the 50 states. And in the latest race this past November between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, he exceeded that by correctly predicting the winner of all 50 states and the District of Columbia. So that is what it means to be Nate Silverishly right about something. And on John's behalf, I commend the phrase to you. So let me ask you to give a round of applause to John, Mick and Sue. Those of you who would like to think about buying a book and for John to sign it, there are people on the stage willing to sell you the book if you would. I don't know how many people will, if anyone, but come up that side and come down this side if there's a rush. Thank you very much, John, Mick and Sue.
Thank you.